Merry Christmas. With the holidays right around the corner, I figured we could do what we do every year. Tell some creepy stories revolving around the holiday. Whether you celebrate Christmas or not, I hope everyone gets some time to at least relax for a few days. This year hasn't been kind to anyone, and I think we all deserve a breather. This year is no exception when it comes to having some spooky stories to share, however. This is true for nearly every video on the channel, but this Christmas video would absolutely not have happened without the generosity of tonight's authors. So I'd like to issue a massive thank you to all of them. Story 1 is written by MikeJesus. He has a YouTube channel where he has various talents narrate his stories. Story 2 is written by Jgrupe, and they have recently released a novel by the name of Beneath the Asylum. You can find links to both of these down in the description, included with the story credits. Again, I can't stress enough how much all of tonight's writers helped out in making this come together. If you find yourself enjoying their work, please check them out. Also, I noticed that most of my videos get over 10,000 views, but it's not too common we reach 1,000 likes, so I want to test something with this video. If at any point you feel this video deserves a like, feel free to leave one. I'm curious how many likes this video can reach. Additionally, if you're new to the channel and would like to hear more in the future, because I post videos all the time, subscribing is greatly appreciated. We're getting close to 90k and I'd love to have you on board. With all of that out of the way, let's get into the stories. I hope you enjoy them, and I hope you all have a very Merry Christmas. The town of Christian Springs was big enough to justify having its own cold storage, but far too small to make proper use of it. On average, I would end up seeing about 5 bodies a month, most of them overdoses from the smaller towns nearby. My work at the morgue was quick and impersonal. No one that I could recognize ever ended up on my table, and the toxicology reports always came back with a clear-cut cause of death, usually something in the realm of opioids. What I saw in that fluorescent lit room always stayed where it belonged. My work life and my family life were always two separate entities. That all changed during the Christmas season of 2003. 2 local bodies were brought in within 24 hours of each other. Neither of them were like anything I had ever seen. The first body once belonged to Chelsea Steeler, a local first grader. After school let out for winter break, Steeler walked off the premises only to return a couple minutes later. Bleeding from her mouth, Steeler stumbled through the school's playground, begging for help, and then collapsed. She was pronounced dead as soon as emergency services arrived. The second body I recognized? Christine Morgan. Morgan was someone that most people in the Christian Springs community would recognize. She was the crazy religious lady. As the name of the town might imply, we had our fair share of Bible thumpers in town, but Morgan's breed of spirituality was considerably more aggressive than anything you could find being peddled by the televangelists the locals watched. Both of the cinemas in Christian Springs banned the women from their premises on account of her interrupting screenings of even the most milquetoast of movies, with her raving sermons. When the local museum set up a dinosaur exhibit, Morgan was banned from there too. To her, dinosaur bones were the work of Satan, created to lead true believers astray. It was Christine Morgan's daughter, 7-year-old Grace Morgan, who discovered the body. When I first heard this bit of information, I found myself pitying the child. My ruminations about Grace Morgan's well-being were soon whisked away by what I discovered during the autopsies. Both of the bodies exhibited internal damage the likes of which I had never seen or read about before. Their stomach lining was shredded to bits. Chunks of their livers were found inside of their esophagus. Every internal organ that was still intact showed signs of extreme scarring. It was as if something had torn them up from the inside. The cause of death was a complete mystery. Aside from a shared geographical location, the 2 women had nothing in common. Yet the severity of their injuries was almost identical. It was as if someone had planted bombs inside of them and sent tiny bits of shrapnel flying through their organs. Yet there was no shrapnel to be found. There was no clear trace of the instrument that had killed these women. On closer observation, however, I found something else that connected the 2 bodies. In the confounding mess of viscera, I found something that made their cause of death seem quaint by comparison. Even though they were bloodied and covered in loose chunks of flesh and membrane, I immediately knew what I was holding in my hands. I was holding 2 tiny gingerbread men. They were small, both fitting into the palm of my glove, but they still inspired fear. Unlike the big-eyed, smiling gingerbread men that were sold in the local bakeries, the creations I held in my hand had tiny slits for eyes, and their mouths were stretched into long, harrowed screams that descended well into their torsos. The baked goods I held in my hand were the product of a disturbed mind. I called just about everyone I went to school with. From the few colleagues that picked up, I couldn't find anyone who was willing to drive over and take a look at my findings. Everyone was either too far away, busy dealing with their personal aspects of the holiday season, or was swamped with the suicide spike that Christmas brings. Even past their business, no one believed me. When I described the 2 foreign objects I found lodged in the bodies, a couple of my old classmates even inquired whether I was sober. Not being able to find any explanation, through my informal channels I called my boss on the county level. His annoyance with my phone call was crystal clear. The town of Christian Springs was not on his radar, and, in his opinion, mysteries that weren't directly connected to criminal investigations were better left unexplored. After a long back and forth, he agreed to drive down and investigate the gingerbread men as soon as his schedule cleared up. He suggested that I shouldn't go into details on my report if I didn't want to undergo a psychological evaluation. I filled out the report as best as I could, but the cause of death still ended up as unknown. After a couple more phone calls to old colleagues who didn't pick up the first time around, I gave up. The mystery of the gingerbread men would have to wait until after the holidays. I placed the cookie creatures face down in a glass jar, put on my coat, drove back home. My wife didn't like me talking about work at home. In fact, she didn't like me talking about work at all. Whenever the question of what I did for a living came up at dinner parties, she'd quickly say I worked with the police, or call me a doctor, and then quickly change the topic. When I came home that evening, I didn't mention anything about the gingerbread men, but all night long those slitted eyes haunted me. I dreamed of my son walking into our bedroom in the middle of the night, clutching his stomach. I dreamed of my wife getting up to comfort him, but soon kneeling over in pain as well. I dreamed of my family lying on those metal slabs, of me cutting their chests open, finding nothing but pink mush where their organs should be. When I woke up that morning, I was overjoyed to find my wife sleeping next to me, unharmed by the baked monstrosities that tore through my sleep. But the joy didn't last long. My family might have been alive, but those 2 gingerbread men were still real. They were still waiting for me in the examination room. During breakfast, my son excitedly told me about his last day of school. I knew he went on a field trip to the museum. I signed the permission slip for it after all, but all my son could talk about was the gingerbread men his class made in the morning. I kept on trying to ask him what his favorite dinosaur exhibit was, but all my son could talk about was his newfound interest in baking. The house phone rang. My wife picked it up. Whatever was being said on the other line made her visibly uncomfortable, but when she came back to the table, she simply resumed eating. It wasn't until my son went outside to play with his friends that she told me that the school called. One of my son's classmates suddenly died. The teachers were calling the parents to let them know. Chelsea Steeler? I asked. She immediately noticed the beginning of a conversation she didn't want to have. Let's not tell him until after Christmas. Let him be a kid for a little longer. I didn't argue. I didn't share the details of what I found inside of Steeler's body. Instead, I told my wife that there was some last-minute paperwork I had to take care of in the examination room before I fully clocked out for the holidays. It wasn't entirely a lie. I did spend some time going through the autopsy report, making sure it didn't sound completely mad, but it wasn't the reason I drove back to work that day. My real reasons were lying face down in a glass jar. Yet when I took the jar out, the gingerbread men weren't lying down. They were pressed up against the glass, facing the outside world. There was no doubt in my mind that the creatures had shifted, that they had somehow stood up in my absence and were looking out into the world with their slitted eyes. For a moment I stood there, confounded by the blood-covered baked goods staring back at me. Yet the longer I stood in the empty examination room, the more I thought about my family. Beyond the corpses, beyond the ripped up muscle and flesh, I had a family. Back home, my wife and son were waiting for me. I closed the cupboard that held the gingerbread men, shut off the lights, and drove back home. It was difficult to keep the malformed creatures out of my head on the drive back, but as soon as I got past my front door, the mysteries of my professional life dissipated beneath the sheer pleasure of spending time with my family. After lunch, the three of us went outside to build a snowman. 2 big eyes of Christmas ornaments, a thick carrot nose, and a wide grin of coal. The creature that my son had constructed wiped away any memory of the harrowing gingerbread men in the examination room. Once the snowman in our front yard had been completed and the sun had set, the three of us settled down on the couch and watched a Christmas movie. I scarcely paid attention to what was on the television. Whatever was on the screen was irrelevant, just a bright backdrop to a calm evening spent with those that I loved. It wasn't until my wife and I were falling asleep that I thought about my work again. Just as she drifted off to sleep, she mentioned that we would have to talk with our son about bullying while I was off finishing my paperwork. My son told my wife about one of his classmates tormenting the daughter of the weird religious lady. Apparently the bully had taken the girl's gingerbread man and ate it in front of the whole class, embarrassing the poor kid. Christine Morgan's daughter? I asked. Probably, my wife said, yawning. Was the bully Chelsea Steeler? I asked. I don't know. He didn't use names, she said, yawning again. But we should talk to him about standing up for the weaker kids. For a moment, I thought about breaking the unspoken rules of my marriage and telling my wife about the 2 corpses in the examination room, but that moment dragged on for too long. By the time I started to whisper my worries, she was already asleep. My mind was still desperately trying to make connections between the 2 bodies and their gruesome deaths, but I forced my eyes shut and tried to get some rest. I hoped that some sleep would help me forget about the gingerbread men. It didn't. I woke up drenched in sweat with my heart racing. In my dreams, I saw my family sitting in the kitchen making gingerbread men. My wife and son seemed so happy, so full of life, so innocent. Yet the cookies that they made shared none of their joy. Slitted eyes and maws of crimson stared back at me from the kitchen table. Slitted eyes that blinked and maws that chomped. Before I could warn them, before I could save my family, the gingerbread men leapt into action. Soon enough, my wife and son were gone, and all that remained of them was blood and mangled skin. Seeing the kitchen clean and free of death brought a tiny bit of calmness to my mind. But I knew that what I truly needed was sleep. With a generous helping of sleeping pills and a nightcap, I returned back to bed. At first, the thoughts of Morgan and Steeler tugged at my mind, but soon enough I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. I woke up to an empty bed that morning. For a moment, past the chemically induced grogginess of my slumber, I found myself worrying about my family being kidnapped by a group of possessed gingerbread men. Walking down to the kitchen and finding my wife and son safe and sound calmed me somewhat, but the calmness didn't last. They were baking gingerbread men. Their creations were unlike the ones I had seen in my dreams. The cookie men they made were cheery and happy and full of pep, but that didn't matter to me. All I could think about were those slitted eyes and screaming maws. All I could think about were the 2 gingerbread men standing in my office, waiting. They invited me to join in on the baking, but I busied myself with beer and television. I hoped that alcohol and channel hopping would distract me, yet all I could think about were the bodies. Regardless of how much I drank or how loud the Christmas music blaring from the television was, all I could think about was Morgan, Steeler, and the cookie men that were lodged in their broken corpses. My mind kept on trying to find some semblance of reason in a bewildering world. Daddy, I made you something. My son's voice cut through my frenzied internal monologue. In his hands, he held a little gingerbread man with a bushy mustache and glasses. The facial hair was made of green frosting, and the glasses were far too big for the man's face. But I could tell that the gingerbread man was meant to be a representation of me. Do you go to school with Grace Morgan? I asked him. He seemed confused by the question, but eventually he nodded. Did Grace ever talk about her mother? Did they get along? I asked him. Gracie's mom was mean, my son said. When the class went to the museum, Gracie's mom was standing outside yelling at us. But did Grace ever talk about her mother? Do you think Grace would ever want to hurt her? Would Grace ever want to hurt Chelsea Steeler? Well, Gracie's mom didn't let her come to the museum with us, and Chelsea was always mean to Gracie, my son said, unsure of my questions. Do you like this gingerbread man I made you? I didn't. Even though the cookie held an innocent smile and was made by the most important person in my life, I could barely look at it. Yet as uncomfortable as I was, the pride in my son's eyes was undeniable. I accepted his cookie. I knew full well that the effigy in my hands was a product of love, but all I could imagine was the little gingerbread man tearing through my insides. Are you going to eat it, Dad? He asked. I promise it's not bad. Mom helped me. I almost told him that I wasn't hungry, or that I would eat the cookie later, but the pride in my son's eyes was undeniable. The pride in my son's eyes was more important than the fear in the pit of my stomach. In one swift motion, I decapitated the gingerbread man with my teeth. Once I was sure his head was crushed enough to not do me any harm, I downed the chunks of gingerbread with a gulp of beer. Tasty, I said. But I wasn't able to mask my discomfort. That evening, as my wife and I wrapped up the Christmas presents, she asked me if I was alright. Both her and my son had noticed that something was bothering me. That evening she was willing to talk about my problems, be they work-related or not. Yet by then my fear of the gingerbread men had grown to such an intensity that it could not be put into words. I told her that work was a bit more stressful than usual this year, but that I would be fine eventually. She asked me if I wanted to talk about it. I didn't. I couldn't. She tried to get me to open up a couple more times, but eventually, with the lights off and the presents packed beneath the tree, I was left alone with my thoughts. My thoughts were singular. I shouldn't have been driving that night. I had drank enough throughout the day for it to be a bad idea, and to make things worse, there was a powerful blizzard that swept through the town that Christmas Eve. Yet I knew that unless I got some closure, I wouldn't be able to sleep. I drove through the curtain of snow until I could see the faint lights of the Christian Springs morgue. The absurdity of it all was a steady drumbeat in the back of my head. But it wasn't until I was standing in the darkness of my office that I consciously acknowledged how insane my trip was. There was nothing to be achieved from closer examination. Morgan and Steeler were dead. There was nothing I could do to bring them back. I almost convinced myself to turn around and go back home. Almost. Just as I was about to turn around and walk away, I heard something. I heard the faintest of taps coming from the cupboard in which I had kept the gingerbread men. Tap, tap, tap. Like little claws knocking on glass. Tap, tap, tap. Like little gingerbread men trying to make their way out. Tap, tap, tap. With my heart in my throat, I opened the cupboard. Stuck in their glass prison, the two gingerbread men stood there, staring straight at me. They were no longer standing in the spread-out pose in which I first found them. Each of them had one of their blood-caked limbs extended, as if they were about to knock on the glass again. I stared at them, waiting for them to move again, waiting for something to happen that would convince me that I had not gone insane. In the dim light of my office, I thought that I could see their eyes twitch. I thought I could see the slightest bit of stifled movement in their mouths. But before I could steady myself to properly look, my phone rang. It was my wife. She woke up in the middle of the night to find her husband missing, to find the car missing. She asked 2 questions. She asked whether I was safe and whether I was having an affair. The implication that I would even be capable of being unfaithful hurt me. But as I assured her that I would never break our marriage vows, I realized how far I had let my mind drift. I closed the cupboard, slid down to the floor of the examination room, and told her everything. I told her about Steeler and Morgan's unfathomable internal damage. I told her about the gingerbread men. I told her about how scared I was. She listened patiently, and with each word that left my lips, with each part of my insane story that I described, I found myself less and less scared. The cause of death was still a mystery, but the pure act of explaining the gingerbread theory made it seem inconceivable. The murderous gingerbread men were not real. What was real was my worried wife, who was waiting for me at home. Once I was all talked out, she asked me to come home. I did. As I shut off the lights and left the examination room, however, the tiniest bit of doubt slithered into my mind. Tap, tap, tap. I ignored it and drove back home. The steadily rotating cast of extended family members that came through our house kept me occupied for the next couple of days. All worries of murderous gingerbread men disappeared beneath the fear that my mother-in-law inspired in me. But that fear wasn't something that haunted my dreams. That fear was manageable. When my wife and I had decided to tell our son about Chelsea Steeler, he didn't seem overly concerned. Apparently his friends had already told him. Just about everyone from his class knew as soon as the playground rumor mill got going. He just never brought it up because he knew that Mommy didn't like talking about death in the house. The kid seemed pretty comfortable about the concept of mortality, but what can one expect from a child whose father works with the police? The day before New Year's, I got called back into work. Another overdose from a town nearby. The ghastly gingerbread men had left my mind completely by then. I simply consigned them to be a part of some minor mental breakdown. Yet when I entered the examination room, the thoughts of those slitted eyes came flooding back. The cupboard was opened, and there was broken glass on the floor. The gingerbread men had escaped. I spent most of January sleepless. I kept on thinking that somehow those two strange creatures made of gingerbread would come and track me down, that they would hurt my family and me because I was aware of their existence. But they didn't. Life carried on as normal. My boss agreed that Morgan and Steeler's injuries were difficult to explain, but he also insisted that they were not important enough to investigate. After the first day of classes, my son informed me that Grace Morgan left town to go live with her grandparents and that no one was particularly sad with the school bully disappearing off campus. Once it became clear that no murderous baked goods were coming after me and my family, the thoughts of those slit-eyed creatures drifted away into the realm of pointless mystery. I still don't understand what I saw the Christmas of 2003, but I have resigned myself to the fact that I will never understand. Sometimes, however, when I find myself sitting in a bar after a medical examiner conference and colleagues start sharing stories of the bizarre and unexplained, I tell my tale of the gingerbread men. Sometimes, when the booze is flowing freely and people's tongues loosen, they tell me that I am not the only coroner who has found baked goods inside of a mangled corpse. Hey, want to go outside for a bit? We've been cramped up in here all year, it feels like. My wife looked up from her phone. She had been browsing Reddit, and I saw her eyes were bleary and confused. Huh? You know, outside. That place we used to go that's not here. Oh, right. She looked back down at her phone. Come on, I'm seriously so bored. Let's go tobogganing or let's make a snowman. What are you, 10 years old or something? She looked up at me, smiling now. Yeah, I am a child in a man's body. You know this. Now can we please get out of here and go do something? I'm not feeling up to it. You go ahead. I sighed and was about to resign myself to staying indoors, but then decided against it. What the hell, I figured. I'll go out by myself and make a snowman just like I did when I was a kid. So I went out to the front lawn and did just that. I began by making a snowball, then rolled it around in the packing snow and watched as it got larger. I pushed it towards the center of the yard, rounded off the rough edges, and set to work on the next big snowball that would be his midsection. By the time I finished that one, I was nearly out of snow. We hadn't gotten much yet, and it had been depleted quickly. I looked around and saw that there wasn't enough to make a head for my snowman. We had a very small yard. The houses were packed tightly together, and space was at a premium in this neighborhood. Glancing across the street, I saw my neighbor still had plenty of snow. The old man who lived there, Mr. Verdwin, was a tall, thin, severe-looking man with black hair that never seemed to gray despite his advanced age. He liked to dress in all black clothing and drove a giant, vintage Mercedes. Also black. He had a reputation in the neighborhood as well, and since we had only moved in recently, I had barely heard the gist of it. I hoped he wouldn't notice me stealing a bit of his snow. He hated people coming onto his property. Had signs everywhere saying, no trespassing, no solicitors, and no visitors even. What an old grouch, I thought. Telling myself I really shouldn't. But I did. I walked across the street and hesitantly stepped onto his lawn. For a second I felt like sirens were about to go off. Police were going to pull up with lights, flashing to arrest me. That's how scary this guy was to me. To all of us. The whole neighborhood was terrified of him due to multiple incidents over the years, but then nothing happened. Felt a bit foolish standing there on his snow-covered lawn, looking scared. It was fine. He was just a grumpy old man. The rumors about him were just that. Rumors. Kneeling down, I started to make a new snowball. This would be the head of my masterpiece. I made it smooth and perfectly spherical. Holding it in my hands, the big basketball-sized snowball felt heavy and just right. Part of me desperately wanted to throw it at a car. Mr. Verdwin's car, specifically. He had run over my cat with a giant gas guzzler barely 6 weeks before. I was about to turn around and walk back across the street when I saw Mr. Verdwin watching me from his front door. The old goat had crept out silently and had been glaring at me from his doorway. He was standing there with his arms crossed and a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Oh, hey, Mr. Verdwin. Sorry, this probably sounds dumb, but I was making a snowman and..." "You ran out of snow?" He seemed amused by my discomfort, basking in it. "Right." I caught myself shuffling back and forth on my feet like a kid caught with his hand in the cookie jar before dinner. "Do you mind?" The whole situation was exceedingly awkward. The man hated people coming onto his property. Loathed it. What had I been thinking? To my surprise, though, he just looked at me, baring his teeth. He didn't appear happy when he smiled. It was a hateful grin. "Wait there." I worried for a moment he was going to get his camera or something for proof to press charges, but the whole idea seemed ludicrous. Still, I took a step back and stood on the street, glancing again at the no trespassing sign I had brazenly ignored. "Here we are," he said as he came out of his house with a black hat in hand. I saw he was wearing his long winter coat and a pair of boots. Of course, all jet black. He surprised me by walking out of the house and straight up to me. The hat in his hand was weathered and faded, starting to turn gray almost. It had a smell also, like week old roadkill. "Frosty needs a hat," he said. His voice was cold as the snow in my hands, which was turning them number by the second. He reached out to me. "May I?" Took the big snowball as if to examine it, and casually handed me the black fedora he was holding. I felt a surge of revulsion the second I touched the thing. I wanted to get it away from me as quickly as possible. Mr. Verdwin granted my wish and offered the blank snowman head for me to place it on top of. He grinned again at me, and this time I could see all of his yellowed teeth, ranging in color from a nicotine-stained yellow-brown to almost black in places. "Have fun." He chuckled and turned back to go inside. Easing the big wooden door slowly closed. His eyes watched me from the crack of the door, staring at me until the space disappeared and it was shut. The whole thing was highly disturbing. Suddenly the big snowball in my hand seemed to tip over of its own volition. I caught it the last second, stopping it from falling onto the road. The blank-faced snowman head stared at me, the fedora resting on top. Without knowing why, I felt a momentary sickness and despair, an utter unpleasantness, as if I was holding a severed head in my hands instead of a big snowball. I tried to shake off that feeling and walked back across the street to my own yard, looking back over my shoulder as I did. Mr. Verdwin was still watching me from his front window. Unsettled, I quickly placed the head of my snowman atop its body and stood back to look at it. Not complete, a new voice in my mind said. It needed something. Several somethings, actually. I went inside and fetched a few items from the house. A carrot for the nose, a classic. A piece of red licorice for the mouth, and a couple marbles for eyes nearly completed the effect. But no, still needed more. I found a couple hefty branches that had fallen from the tree during the last storm and stuck them into the torso on either side. Perfect, I thought. I stood back again to look and saw that the illusion was complete. The glassy reflections of the marble eyes looked almost human. The bright red licorice mouth gave a slightly more unsettling smile than I had anticipated. But the hat was the kicker. I didn't like it, but it certainly completed the look of him. Looked over my shoulder again, but Mr. Verdwin was gone, no longer watching me. Sufficiently cold and feeling unsettled for reasons I couldn't explain, I decided to go back inside. Have fun making your snowman? Christine asked from the kitchen where she had started to make dinner. What are we having? I asked, ignoring the question. The fact was the entire thing had turned sour once Mr. Verdwin had decided to get involved. Pasta with mushrooms. We needed to use up those ones from the bottom of the fridge. They were starting to go bad. Nice, my favorite. Slightly expired mushroom pasta. Hey, if it tastes disgusting, we'll go get chicken nuggets or something, but we can't keep wasting food. I know, it's true. That night after dinner, which actually tasted pretty good by the way, my wife and I were looking out the front window. Why did you make it facing the house? What? The snowman. It's like it's looking at us in here. Why'd you do that? Shouldn't it be looking at the street? I approached the window and looked out through the glare and reflections shining back at me from the lights inside the house. I squinted to see the snowman I had made was looking right back at me, his marble eyes looking very human in the dull light of the moon. I stood there trying to make sense of it. Why are you looking at it like that? For whatever reason I can't explain, I kept it to myself. I figured it was just kids playing a prank, but what kind of prank was that? No reason. It's nothing. I lied. I saw snow falling in the glow of the streetlights and noticed it beginning to accumulate on the lawn. Later that night, while I slept, I had a terrible nightmare. I was standing in front of a giant wall made of ice. My reflection looked back at me in it like a mirror, only bluer. The feeling I had was one of anxiety, as if someone was going to sneak up behind me and grab my shoulder at any second. But there was no one behind me in the vast, reflective surface of the ice wall in my dream. Or so I thought. A tree branch suddenly popped out from one side, then one on the other. As if by magic, the snowman I had made rose up behind me, materializing from thin air. He leaned large over me and wrapped his tree branch arms around me in an embrace, his red licorice mouth opening up to reveal a mouth that stretched wider and wider as I watched. The twig ends of the tree branch arms began to grow and stretch across my skin like ivy on a building. They began to poke into my skin and I felt them puncture and go inside, reaching for my heart and wrapping themselves around it. My breathing sped up and my heartbeat quickened with fear as the branches continued to cover my body, going into my mouth and encapsulating my face. Once I was covered in the hateful growth, the snowman stepped forward and the freezing cold of him began to envelop me. In my dream, I closed my eyes from the terror of it all and opened them again to see myself as normal. Only my eyes were marbles, my nose a carrot, and my mouth a piece of red licorice. I tried to scream and found I couldn't. I woke up covered in cold sweat, or so I thought. Stepping out of the bed, I found a puddle of ice-cold water on the ground beside where I slept. I couldn't make any sense of it. Maybe I had been sleepwalking and poured water on the floor. That was the only rational explanation I could suggest. I went out of the bedroom and got towels to mop up the water from the linen cabinet. Christine had already left for work, I realized. She had been working extra hours leading up to Christmas, but it was earlier than usual for her to go in for her shift. After cleaning up the water, I went to the kitchen and made a coffee, then looked outside as I took a sip. I nearly spit it out in surprise. The snowman was gone. Just gone. Almost like he had walked away during the night. Any tracks had been covered by the freshly fallen snow. My first thought was Mr. Verdwin. He was behind this somehow. It wasn't kids playing pranks. It was him. The dream occurred to me again, and that voice in my mind spoke up. Snowman isn't missing. You're the snowman now. Don't you feel it? The ice in your veins. As I looked at the spot where the snowman should have been, I noticed something. Mr. Verdwin across the way, staring out his window at me. A steaming mug of something was in his hand, and he was staring at me intently. Then I saw the car was still in the driveway. Christine, are you here? I called out knowing that she wouldn't be. Christine? And then I felt it, resting atop my head. The black felt fedora, as if it had been there all along, but it wasn't such a part of me I hadn't paid attention to it. The thing suddenly felt like it was an extension of my body, another limb like an arm but on top of my head. The revulsion I had felt before at the feel of it flared up again 1,000 times worse at the thought, and I reached up to pull it off me. It wouldn't come off. I ran to the bathroom to look in the mirror and saw what looked like vines growing down the side of my now pale face from the fedora. No, not vines. Branches. They drove down into my skin at places and blood seeped from those spots, dripping black and running down my neck. Ice cold. Screaming, I tried to rip it off my head, but found it wouldn't come off. Pulling on it hurt worse than anything I'd ever felt before. White lights shooting before my eyes each time I tried, getting more painful with each attempt. In my mind's eye, I saw it again. The dream I had the night before, looking at my own face in the reflection of ice. My eyes were glass marble staring back at me. I breathed out and my breath plumed into the air as if I was outside on a February day. Despite the heat of the furnace, it's going to be a very cold winter, and I am not looking forward to the spring. For the past 2 years, I've been studying abroad in Italy, but 3 nights ago, I returned home to Minnesota for Christmas break. Upon my return, I was greeted by my aunt and my 3 cousins, as well as my mother. My mother mentioned to me a few months in advance that they had been staying there for a while as their rental contract had run out on their apartment, and my uncle had been absent from July. My aunt had barely any money left, and I couldn't pick up a job since one of my cousins was only 5.5 months old. As I entered the living room that day, I noticed that everyone had put up the tree without me, even though there was still 2 weeks to go before Christmas. It offended me a little, but the kids didn't want to wait. My mom offered to take my bags up to my room immediately when she saw the disappointed look on my face. I followed her up there because I didn't want to be bombarded with the chaos my cousins usually bring with them. I was completely shocked when we walked straight past my bedroom and over to the loft staircase. I asked my mom why we were heading that way, and she set the bags on the floor, slowly turning around. Her face was bright red, and I recall her saying, "Well, your aunt needs a little bit more space, honey. She's used to sleeping in a bigger bed, and I can't imagine putting her on the couch, so we had to move you up to the loft. You understand, don't you? You've been sleeping on a cot in Italy anyway. It's exactly the same." After saying that, my mom turned back around, grabbed my luggage, and trudged up the loft stairs. No, our loft staircase does not have a door at the bottom, just one at the top which doesn't have a lock. That night was freezing cold. The loft window doesn't have a seal on it because it's centuries old. My cot bed had a broken spring, no topper, and it was made of the most uncomfortable green mesh. At least my mom had the decency to give me a spare comforter. I lay on the cot begrudgingly, as I thought about my aunt and how she was living it up in my cozy room. The next day was fine. Everyone pitched in for Christmas groceries at the store. We played Jenga later at home, and no one knocked over Mom's planter this week. I took myself to bed early and decided to read my notes for my January exams. As I was around halfway through the 3rd page, I noticed my mom is standing in the doorway holding a large, flat, rectangular box. I asked her what exactly she was about to do with it, but before I could even open up my mouth, she set it down against the door frame. "I love you, honey," she said before leaving quickly. I shuffled over to the box and hastily laid it down, tore off the wrapper, and gently wiggled the item out. A mirror. She got me a mirror. I already had a mirror in my room, and it was a lot prettier than this one. This mirror looked like it was stolen from an old woman's attic. I'm not really that much of an ungrateful person, so I hung it up on the wall adjacent to the cot bed and went to sleep. In the middle of the night, the mirror fell off the wall, snapping me out of a nightmare. I was grateful, honestly, because my dream was horrifying. Anyway, I hung the mirror back up, thinking to myself about how I could prop it up on something the next day. The very next morning, the mirror was still on the wall, but facing the other way around. I went downstairs to ask my mother if she had moved it, explained how it fell from the wall once already, but she cut me off. My mother said that she had no idea there was a mirror in the loft. I paused. For a second, I thought she was kidding, but she went on to tell me that her and my aunt had fallen asleep on the couch shortly after I went upstairs, and my cousins had been throwing Christmas ornaments at each other all night. She really didn't know about the mirror. I ran back to my loft, and to my surprise, the mirror was now the right way around on the floor. I picked it up and put it back where it was last night, but as I did so, I looked into it. I quickly noticed that the scene before me in the mirror was not the loft, and I was not looking back at myself. Instead of my reflection, there was a window-like view of an old woman sat in an armchair. The woman was almost a fully decomposed corpse in a beautiful cottage living room. Her curly gray hair sat on top of her head like a shredded hat. The cottage window next to her was filthy and covered in dust. I was about to rush out of the room when, in the corner of my eye, I noticed movement. I looked as closely as I could, but I couldn't for the life of me find anything around her corpse. My eyes flicked over the chair and I almost threw up out of fear. Her rotting, bony fingers were still knitting. I dropped the mirror and fainted. When I woke up, I was laid on my couch, my mom hovering over me. She whispered to me, "Sweetie, I'm so sorry. Your great-grandma passed, but we swung by the house today. She made you a gift for your return home. Here you go." I sat up and cautiously unwrapped the gift. It was a homemade scarf. Jessie looked at me in wonderment, Christmas lights twinkling above her head. Jessie had been a much sought-after blessing, one that we had paid thousands for, and years in agonizing treatments and trials. Jessie was testament that miracles could happen, and she was a gift that kept giving to us. The snow started to tumble delicately down, flakes settling with abandonment where they fell. It couldn't have been more perfect, the ideal Christmas setting. Life was a bounty of beauty and serenity. We were entranced in a Hallmark movie scene, watching Michael with our daughter. Wine in hand, I couldn't feel more content. I didn't know if the flush was from the wine or being present in the moment. I was so entranced that I failed to hold the glass tight enough and the red wine escaped the shattered glass, pooling at Michael's feet. But it wasn't red wine and Michael was no longer standing. The liquid was too thick. How did it get up the walls? Why was it sprayed up the fire? Convulsion enveloped me as a scream escaped from my mouth. Why was Michael on the floor? Why was Jessie now slumped over him? Jessie, my beautiful Jessie. I tried to get out of my chair, but I felt that I was being pushed back. The lights were brighter over my head. Why couldn't I get to Jessie? 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 I was screaming as everything faded to black. The snow tumbled with abandon as I looked out of the window. Michael passed me a glass of wine as I watched our beautiful Jessie underneath the Christmas lights. She was laughing, her eyes twinkling, as she gently fingered the dress of the angel. I saw her jump up to her daddy, as she waited to be balanced on his shoulders. As they put the angel on the tree, I laughed with them. Happiness surrounded our family as we relished our Christmas tradition. The wine escaped from my hand as I moved to help Jessie return to the ground. It spilled across the floor, surrounding the fire, and seemed to flood the walls with its red spray. I watched in horror as I looked around and saw Jessie slumped over her father. Her new dress seemed to be stuck to her body, like she'd worn it wet. I seemed to realize I was screaming her name as Michael tried to talk, blood bubbling from his lips. I tried to reach him, help him, save him from what I didn't understand, but I couldn't seem to move. I was walking through nothingness, screaming his name as everything faded to black. I was sitting somewhere I didn't recognize. There was no snow at the window. There was no tree or fire. Fear ran through my body. Where was I? I tried to lift my hands, but they were strapped to the arms of the chair. Screams erupted from my mouth as I begged for Michael and Jessie. Where were they? Where was I? The only thing I could taste was my fear. The door I hadn't even noticed to the left opened. Screaming again, I begged to be let go. Where's Jessie? Where's Michael? I cried out. A man entered and grabbed a chair from the wall and sat down in front of me. Terror washed over me. A familiarity of this man made my bladder empty its contents. I was scared into silence as he began to talk. Anne-Marie, don't be scared. We have been through this and you know who I am. Bewilderment continued to mute me as I watched his lips start to move again. Anne-Marie, we can't keep going through this. It's been 17 years. You were in the Arundel Mental Hospital, and you are safe. He took another breath as I began to scrape the wood underneath my hands. You are restrained for your own safety, so please don't try to rip them off again. It will hurt you, and you will be sedated. Looking at my arms, I see unfamiliar white lines and scratches. Some old and some appeared new. Dry blood had appeared to pool at the bottom of my wrists. Anne-Marie, he began, his voice startling me to the present again. We need to discuss the screaming in your room, calling for Michael and Jessie. You know they aren't there. You know what happened that day. You know it was you who had the knife and confronted Michael and Jesse at the Christmas tree. I started to scream again. I know I called their names. I screamed a scream so visceral, I knew it could all fade away. But it didn't fade to black. He was still opposite me. I was still strapped in the chair, and the dawning of my realization was written all over his face. Unexplained events have been happening ever since last week, when my first Amazon mystery package arrived. It all started last Monday, when a white, unmarked van rolled up to my house that morning. An elderly woman with long, unruly gray curls crawled out, carrying a large package wrapped in red ribbon to my porch. Oh, how nice, I thought. Who's this from? I admit, I kind of hoped it was from a secret admirer, but I doubted it. Get real, Brent, I told myself. But I hadn't ordered anything from Amazon since last month, when I'd finished my Christmas shopping. What could this be? I carried the package into the kitchen and opened it. Inside the box were layers of festive green, red, and reindeer-printed tissue paper. But the box looked empty. After searching some more, an envelope sealed with a gold sticker appeared at the bottom of the box. Mr. Smith was scrawled across the envelope in large, sloppy crayon letters. A child's handwriting. What child would have sent this? Besides, I didn't have, or even know, any children. Who would send such a strange gift? And why go to such trouble to wrap a note? Why not just mail the card instead? Inside the envelope was a thin strip of paper that looked like a fortune from the inside of a cookie, but the paper was flamingo pink instead of white. The note read, "A child will be born." That was it. No signature, no explanation, no note underneath saying, "Just kidding." Huh? I asked out loud. A child? What on earth? I grabbed my phone and dialed my sister. "Hey Claire," I said. "Did you send me a present from Amazon?" She laughed. "Oh, sorry," she said, sounding confused. "Why do you ask?" "Someone sent me an Amazon package with a note in it, and I'm trying to solve the mystery." Who knows? Maybe you have a secret admirer." She laughed. Then I laughed, probably a little too loudly. "Funny today, aren't we?" "Well, Brent," she said. "Not to change the subject, but since we're on the phone, I might as well tell you the news." Her voice burst with energy, sounding giddy. "Oh yeah?" I asked, still thinking about the freak show of a package that had just arrived at my door. "Guess what?" "What?" "I'm pregnant," she squealed, like a senior at an after-prom party. "Oh my god," I exclaimed, shocked and a bit horrified. "Who's the father?" Claire hadn't mentioned seeing anyone special for months, but she sounded so excited about the news I had to ask. She paused, sighing. "It's probably Randy," she said, "from my yoga class. We just started dating. Good guy though. Vegan, low sugar, gluten-free, you know. Sometimes he smokes hash, but whatever. We all have our vices." "Oh?" I asked, my tone equal parts polite and curious. But goosebumps rippled over my skin as I reread the note from the Amazon package. "A child will be born." Was this some kind of joke? I wondered, who's behind this? The next morning around the same time, I was working at my computer when car tires squealed in the driveway. An engine huffed and hummed. I peeked through the blinds. It was the same Amazon delivery woman from yesterday, carrying another large package wrapped in red ribbon. This time, I greeted her at the door. "How you doing today?" She said with a jarringly loud Boston accent. "Pretty good. And you?" She nodded. "I could have been better." She grunted, then turned to walk away. "Hey," I said before she left. "Do you know how I could find out who sent the package I got yesterday?" She shrugged. "Call customer service," she said, then walked away before I'd finished speaking. With the holiday madness, I'd never get anyone on the phone. Why bother? I figured. After waiting a few moments, I opened the package and read ribbon, sighing. Here we go again. Just like before, another ocean of green, red, and reindeer-printed tissue paper greeted me, bursting from the box with Christmas cheer. I waded through the forest of tissue paper, then grabbed the envelope at the bottom of the box. Again, like before, my name was scrawled across the front of the envelope in crayon. Inside the envelope was another thin pink strip of paper, but this one read, "A puppy will arrive, but warning, appearances deceive." "A puppy?" I said under my breath. "What?" I set the envelope on the counter, then returned to work. Whatever, I thought. An hour later, just as I was finishing a report for my boss, a knock sounded at my door. A boy of about 10 or 12 stood on the porch looking sad. "Hey there," I said. "What can I do for you?" He clasped his hands behind him, like he was holding on to something. "Hey," he said, flashing a nervous smile. "I'm Bradley." Then, after a moment, he unclasped his arms, swinging them around to reveal a tiny Pomeranian on a silver leash. Bradley handed me the leash. "Please take care of him," he said. "Oh, no," I started. "I can't." But before I could object, the boy darted off, bolting down the street like an Olympian sprinter, then vanishing around the corner. I looked down at the puppy, wagging its tail and smiling. Around his collar was a bone-shaped name tag that read, Buster. No address, no telephone number, no owners, just Buster. "Oh my," I said. "Who would name you such a thing?" I pet him, stroking his rust-colored fur as he wagged his tail and smiled. Oh well, I thought. I had wanted to adopt a rescue dog anyway. This might work out after all. "Well, Buster," I said, "welcome home." The third morning played out just like the 2 mornings before. Same delivery woman, same box, same ribbon, same envelope. Different note. This time, the tone was more ominous. The note read, "Lock your doors. Someone's watching." Chills rippled up my spine and I shuddered. Buster barked, sounding uncharacteristically aggressive. He growled like a pit bull, looking at nothing in particular in the living room. I followed his gaze as he looked up at something several inches shorter than me, but still much taller than him. But I saw nothing significant aside from a bland, all beige living room. But just to be safe, I locked the front door, then walked through every room of the house to secure the windows and doors. But in the spare bedroom, the window was cracked open at just the right amount of space for someone to crawl through. The white linen curtains billowed in the winter breeze, like an omen. On the windowsill was a pink post-it that read, "Lock me." I followed the instructions without question. Later that night, I looked back at the Amazon box that had arrived that day, searching for signs of the sender's identity but found nothing. I flipped on the television, letting it play in the background while I worked at my computer. The voices on the TV droned on, like background noise, until one report caught my ear. "Breaking news tonight," an anchor woman announced. "Here's the latest on what police say is the work of a phantom burglar. Good evening, Chad. What's the latest?" "Good evening, Shannon," the male reporter's son. "Police say the phantom burglar has struck again, this time in an unexpected location. Around 7 this evening, the burglar frightened an elderly couple in the quiet, low-key Turtle Bluffs neighborhood at their home, near Chadwick and Foothill Roads." "My God," I gasped. "That's right here. That's this neighborhood. No, wait. That's right around the corner." The camera flashed to the home of the scene, a small yellow house on the corner right around the street from my house. The couple that had been victimized lived 20 seconds away. Holy shit. I thought of the note from earlier, along with the open spare bedroom window from this morning. My heart thumped, and my stomach flip-flopped as the chunks rose up my throat. Who was sending these letters? And how did this person know so much? The next morning, when the package arrived, I hesitated before reading the note. I paced back and forth in front of the unopened envelope for a while, contemplating whether to open it. Finally, unable to resist, I opened it. This time the note read, Don't look in the mirror. Say what? I said aloud. How am I supposed to do that? I set the strip of paper on the counter and forgot about it. I returned to my desk to finish my report. Still, I avoided mirrors for the rest of the day. I figured, well, technically, I was working from home, so I could loaf around all day looking like shit and who'd care. That night, I turned on the news, half expecting to hear another crazy report, but I heard nothing unusual. I went to sleep that night without trouble and woke up around 6 the next morning to the sound of a loud crash. Buster barked and growled like a savage beast. For a 5-pound dog, he had the bark and growl of a demon-possessed Doberman. I looked at him, alarmed. What was that noise? I grabbed a baseball bat out of the closet and crept through the house, listening for movement. Silence. I rounded the corner to the staircase and tiptoed down the steps. The floorboard above me creaked. I jerked my head up to look, but nothing was there. The morning sunlight was creeping up through the darkness now, streaming its first rays of sun into the entryway, bathing the staircase in a soft golden light, looking serene and ethereal. I crept across the entryway, toward the living room and kitchen, pressing my body against each wall, police style, before rounding the next corner. No one. Then, down the hallway, outside the guest bathroom, I found shards of glass sprinkled all throughout the carpet, forming a trail from the hall to the bathroom. I flipped on the light. The entire wall-to-wall mirror in the guest bathroom had been busted out. The entire mirror had shattered. Later, after the police arrived to check out the scene, they shook their heads, baffled, looking around for clues of some crime, but finding nothing. No idea how that happened, one of the policemen said, shaking his head as he scribbled into a notepad without looking up. I've never heard of a mirror breaking apart on its own before. He grunted. Some weird shit. He kept scribbling his notes, never looking up. I nodded. He handed me his business card. Have a nice day, he said without a hint of emotion, with the same tone he'd used to order a grilled cheese sandwich at a diner. Call if you need anything, he said. The final note arrived Friday morning, December 18th. But this one was the worst of all. I greeted the delivery woman at the door as she crept up the porch at the speed of a sea turtle treading through a waiting pool. Good morning, you, she said, smiling. She reached over and pinched my cheek. I wasn't expecting that and just smiled awkwardly. But this time, she was wearing a name tag. Gertrude Morris. I thanked her, took the package, and opened it inside. I opened the envelope inside the box and read the note, bracing myself. They didn't survive. At that moment, all the frustration and the confusion and the apprehension and the all-around creepiness of the past week closed in on me, and I'd had enough. Enough! I yelled at the empty room. What is this? A joke? It's not funny. Silence. I went to work at my computer, trying to put the image of that last note out of my head. I typed up my report for work. I waited, wringing my hands, pacing across the kitchen, back and forth a few times, waiting for something to happen, waiting to hear some kind of terrible news. I imagined turning on the news and hearing some horror story about an accident or a robbery or worse, but the hours passed by without trouble or tragedy. That night, I went to sleep around midnight, wondering if the whole drama had ended. Soon, I drifted off into a dreamless sleep. The next day, an hour earlier than usual, I took Buster for a walk and discovered the package already sitting on the porch. I waited for Buster to emerge from the shrubbery. Then I picked up the package off the doorstep. This one was wrapped in a green ribbon, and inside, on the envelope, my name was typed. Curious, I opened the envelope, expecting to see the usual strip of paper, but instead, I found a surprise. Inside the envelope was a pink post-it that read, "Look in the box." I returned to the box, digging through the jungle of wrapping paper and pulled out a rolled-up newspaper. I peeled off the rubber band and unrolled it. On the front page was the date, December 11th, 2020. As I unrolled it, a collage of faces appeared under one article entitled, 101 dead in Albany plane crash. I'd heard all about that last week. Tragic story, but why was the newspaper in the box? I wondered. I slipped on my reading glasses and studied the faces of the deceased passengers. The plane had crashed soon after takeoff. Engine failure, killing almost everyone on board. But when I looked at the passengers' faces again, I froze. Wait, I thought I recognized some of those faces. As I matched faces to names, my heart raced. 2 pictures caught my eye as I read. One was a photo of a dark-haired boy with a nervous smile, along with the caption, Bradley Bennett, age 11, Albany, New York, killed. The other was a photo of a smiling elderly woman with long gray curls, with the caption, Gertrude Morris, age 81, Boston, Michigan, killed. My jaw dropped as all of the pieces of the mystery fell into place. The boy on the doorstep with the dog, the Amazon delivery woman who had delivered my packages almost every day this week. But when I looked back at the article, a line of blue ink caught my eye under one of the captions. It looked like someone's handwriting. It read, Sorry about the mirror. I didn't mean to. I froze in disbelief. But how could this be? I didn't know. I still don't know. But what I do know is the events of this past week have challenged things I thought I knew and believed in. Oh, and about the package I got with the newspaper. It was the last one I got. I haven't seen Gertrude since. I became one of those parents you feel bad for on Facebook, or back in 2005 MySpace. Our 7-year-old daughter Grace, who seemed to be the next soccer star, had a penny-sized bruise on her right leg from falling down while playing soccer. My wife Gina and I brushed it off as nothing. But as the days went by, the size of the bruise had expanded to nearly her whole leg. Then Gina and I knew there was something wrong. We took Grace to the nearby Lehigh Valley Hospital in Pennsylvania. We were thinking Grace had some type of clotting disorder like hemophilia, but it was actually something that could be viewed as being much worse. After going through a barrage of tests, Grace was diagnosed with an aggressive form of childhood leukemia. After hearing the news, all the trivial things that ever bothered me, like my job, ended. The doctor really didn't sugarcoat it, and basically told us that Grace's chances of survival were slim to none. We had the choice of treating the cancer aggressively or allowing only palliative care where Grace would knowingly die in weeks, but without the harmful effects of chemotherapy and radiation. We decided to treat the cancer with aggressive chemotherapy, infusions, and radiation. It didn't take long for Grace's hair to fall out, and she remained bedbound at the hospital. Gina stayed with her for most of the days, and I would go visit Grace in the hospital after work. The one Tuesday in mid-December 2005, I was just so heartbroken how weak and how much pain Grace was in that I decided that I needed to take a break and go to the local mall. The doctor's prognosis on Grace's survival has become really poor to the point where they wanted to stop the chemo infusions. I cried the whole day driving to the mall. I questioned why I was alive and what was the purpose of anything. I figured that I would go to the fledgling Strawbridge's department store that my parents used to take me when I was a kid. I walked around the store in despair, and I also had moments of anger. Nowhere in our plans was for our daughter to die at 7 years old. We thought about Grace going to college and whether or not we would allow her to date in high school. But who thinks about their 7-year-old daughter's funeral? As I walked down the aisles, it looked like the department store was close to going out of business because of the lack of merchandise. Down one of the clearance return aisles, I saw what looked like a poorly repacked artificial tree that a customer had returned. I had a thought that maybe I would take a fake tree for Grace. The doctor had talked about allowing Grace to die at home on hospice care. From the cost of the chemo and radiation treatments, and from Gina being out of work, we had taken out so many loans that actually having $5 in my pocket was surprising. I brought the poorly wrapped tree looking thing up to the register. The cashier looked at it and said, "What is this, a lawn ornament or something?" She looked around at the poorly returned package for a barcode or some type of numbers to put into the cash register. She kind of giggled and said, "I don't even think this thing originated from our store. Where did you get this?" I pointed towards the aisle where I got it from and I said, "Over there." The cashier said, "Yeah, that makes sense. We're trying to get everything out of our stockroom that has been sitting around for years." She giggled and then said, "This looks like it's been sitting around for many years, or a customer just dumped it off on the shelf." "Well, I don't know how much to charge you." I said, "How about $5? She giggled again and said, "That's fine." I loaded the package in the car and went home. I wanted some form of normalcy, so I decided to set up the tree versus going back to the hospital. Gina and I had talked about possibly getting a real Douglas fir tree or something, but we didn't want the germs around us that the hospital warned us about from things like plants that would get Grace sick with her weakened immune system. I took the thing out of the poorly wrapped package and I said, "Geez, this thing is in poor shape. How old is this thing?" The tree kind of reminded me of one of the Charlie Brown's episodes, and just how bare it looked. The tree came with lights. As I looked at the lights, I said, "This has to be one of the first artificial trees ever made." The cord looked like it was made before the 1940s. The tree stood a little over 4 feet. It came with a tree topper that I was reluctant to put on top of the tree because it just looked creepy. I don't know if it was supposed to be some type of fallen angel or some type of pagan deity. The pathetic looking tree was complete and I said out loud, "Well, you get what you pay for." I was reluctant to plug in the lights. I didn't know if the lights would explode or if they would cause the electrical outlet to explode from poor wiring. I decided to close my eyes and plug it in anyway. The plug to the tree was wrapped in some type of paper mesh that wouldn't have passed fire codes in the 1950s. I thrusted the cord into the outlet and was thankful I wasn't shocked. The white lights barely came on. They looked like a flashlight that was going to lose power at any moment. I took a step back and thought, well, that's it. I then said to myself, we don't have any presents or anything else to put under the tree. I looked around the house and I really didn't see anything, so I mockingly took off my wedding band and placed it underneath the tree. As I did that, my tree actually got a little brighter. I stood there puzzled thinking, what the heck just happened? I looked for something else to put under the tree. Grace had an unopened toy from her birthday that she didn't want, so I put it under the tree and nothing happened. The lights didn't get any brighter. I then went upstairs to my wife's jewelry box and got the diamond ring that her grandmother had given her, which she was reluctant to sell for money. I put the ring under the tree and once again the tree lights got a little brighter. I sat down on the couch next to the tree. I was just perplexed. A few moments later, the phone rang and Gina sounded really happy and surprised. Gina told me that for the first time in weeks, Grace had enough energy to talk in complete sentences. We said goodbye to each other and I rubbed my hands back and forth through my hair. I thought to myself that before I left the hospital this morning, Grace looked lifeless, and I was actually expecting to hear horrible news from Gina. So I got in my car and rushed down to the hospital. There was my daughter with her eyes open and actually answering questions, though she was still weak. Felt an overwhelming amount of joy. This was the first time in weeks that Grace had actually shown any signs of improvement. It just didn't make any sense. I saw her with my own 2 eyes this morning. I sat down in the chair next to my daughter's bed. My wife then looked at my left hand and said, "What happened to your ring? You didn't sell it, did you?" I paused for a moment, then I thought to myself, what a coincidence with placing my ring and Gina's grandmother's ring under the tree, and the tree responding with its lights getting brighter. I then thought, did this have anything to do with Grace getting better? I looked at Gina's left hand and said, "Let me borrow your ring?" Gina said, "Why?" I said, "Don't worry about it. I'll tell you later." Gina reluctantly took off her ring and handed it to me. I said goodbye to Grace and Gina and told them I was going to do something at home for a little bit. I got home and put Gina's ring under the tree and instantaneously the tree got a little brighter. Within a few moments, Gina called again and said, "You're never going to believe this. Grace asked for food. She's actually hungry. The nurse gave her a cracker and she's actually eating it." I was at a loss for words. I took a step back and looked at the tree. I didn't even know if it was a Christmas tree or something else. I didn't tell anyone regarding the possible healing powers of the tree, not even Gina. I went to my parents' house and I asked them if I could borrow whatever jewelry they had. My parents felt so bad for me with everything that was going on with Grace that they didn't even question my motives. They just gave me whatever jewelry they had. I went home with the jewelry my parents gave me and I put the jewelry under the tree. I waited a few moments and Gina had called back again. This time she was just so hysterical with excitement. She said, "Grace just said she wants to go for a walk. Can you believe this? She actually wants to get up and walk." "I'll be right there." Then I hung up the phone. I rushed over to the hospital, and when I walked into the nursing unit, it looked like there was just about every doctor in the country there outside my daughter's room. As I got closer, I could hear one of the doctors say, "That little girl was discussed in the morning's meeting. She was expected to die at any time." I rushed past the doctors, and there was my daughter sitting up in bed. Even though she had no hair, she looked completely healthy. I gave her the biggest hug, and Gina and I were crying with delight. A few days went by, and all of the tests the doctors ran came back showing that the cancer had disappeared. The leading cancer doctor in the state of Pennsylvania had come over to look all of Grace's tests over from the beginning. He was completely stunned that not only did the cancer disappear when the chemo and radiation was stopped, but there was no harm that was done to any of Grace's tissues or organs. He said there was actually no way this was possible, but science was always emerging, and this was the very first of its kind. Within a couple of days, Grace was actually coming home for Christmas as a normal, healthy girl, and not to die. Gina has not seen the tree yet. She just didn't want to miss a moment with Grace in the hospital. 2 days before Christmas, Grace actually came home. She was able to walk through the front door on her own. As Grace and Gina got into the living room, they both kind of just looked at the tree. The two of them looked at it almost like a piece of art that they didn't understand what it was. It was such a blessing to watch Grace walk around the house. I had nearly given up all hope. Grace said that she wanted to go to Toys R Us to pick up Christmas presents, so we left the house so she could pick out what she wanted. Someone had donated $300 for Grace for Christmas gifts. After Grace went through the store to pick out what she wanted, I then told Gina to take Grace to a different store so I could purchase the toys. I hid the toys in the trunk of the car and then we drove home. Eventually Grace went to sleep and Gina and I wrapped the presents. I stepped out of the living room, where Gina was wrapping presents, to go into the kitchen to get a glass of water. As I proceeded back to the living room, I heard the most horrible sound a father can hear. It was a loud shrieking sound that came from Grace's room upstairs. It was like her lungs had collapsed and she was gasping for air. The tree lights got dim. I quickly looked at Gina's left hand and I saw her wedding ring when I looked under the tree and saw the ring was missing. I grabbed Gina's left arm and forcibly took the ring off her finger. I then put the ring back under the tree, which instantaneously got brighter again, and at the same time I stopped hearing Grace gasp for air. Gina had a stunned look on her face from me nearly breaking her finger, but we were both more concerned about rushing upstairs to see if Grace was okay. Grace was okay when we saw her. She was breathing normally. I told her that she just had a bad dream. Gina and I went back downstairs and I told her everything about the tree. She was speechless. She saw with her own eyes of what happened when her ring was taken away from the tree, and when the ring was put back, and how it affected Grace. We decided to kneel in front of the tree to show reverence. We didn't know who we were praying to, either good or evil, but it didn't matter because it was keeping Grace alive. Gina and I would have sold our souls to the devil from day one when we brought Grace to the hospital, if that's what it took to save Grace's life. Christmas morning came, and we decided to put Grace's presents in the kitchen. We just didn't want to create any bad mojo with the tree. After opening the presents, Gina and I knelt in front of the tree for an hour. A couple of days had went by, and Grace started to complain that she felt weak. Gina and I both looked at each other, knowing what needed to be done. We discussed that I would drive to the rich outskirts of Philadelphia to the town of Villanova, which is one of the richest parts of the United States. I parked my car at the Villanova College to help blend in. Then I walked down one of the residential streets. I saw an older lady walking her dog and noticed she had a large diamond ring on. I walked up behind her, and told her to give me her ring and to not turn around. The older lady obliged, and I rushed home with the ring and put it under the tree, which gave Grace her strength back. As the months went by, I realized the more valuable the item I put under the tree, the longer Grace stayed healthy. My father was into fine art, and I was talking to him about different art collectors that he knew. He told me of this guy who owned an original Claude Monet painting in the affluent town of Bryn Mawr. He told me they were from a wealthy Jewish family heritage. I staked out the Bryn Mawr house for a month and noticed a pattern of the family going to the temple on Saturdays. My father had personally seen the painting in the Bryn Mawr house, so I knew where to go once I got into the house. I waited for the next Saturday and quickly hurled myself over their fence. I knew by breaking their house window I would set off the house alarm, so I acted quickly, and within 5 minutes, I was able to get the painting out of the house. I made a mad dash back over the fence and ran to my car, which was about a quarter of a mile away. I went home and put the painting under the tree, which really shined brightly after adding the painting. It's been 2 years, and we haven't taken down the tree. Grace has been really healthy, and every cent that Gina and I make goes to the tree.